Hi, I'm Madeline James. This is part 5 of my Culture and Society Worldbuilding Guide for populating our Earth-like fantasy worlds with realistic cultures and people. This video will be coupled with the blog version on my website. But in the last part, we mapped out a global classical antiquity map and discussed hunter-gatherers, subsistence-based bands, the origins of early states, where and how they form, and the requirements for one of these states to form. This video builds off the earlier videos in this series and my global world building guide, but as long as you have equivalent maps, you should be good. Now that we have our antiquity maps, I had planned to dive into the Middle Ages next, but I realized we have a lot of information and factors to consider first, so instead of having one giant step, cough, rocks and mineralogy, cough, cough, first we are going to talk about empires, imperialism, democracy, autocracy, and bureaucracy. This is going to be important concepts going forward and are a bit too much to combine with mapping our Middle Age maps. This part will be a bit information heavy, but we will use those concepts to make a new layer on our existing antiquity maps, and they will assist with our Middle Ages eras in the next part as well. When we think about history, it is typically the empires that stand out in our mind as the great people of the past. To an extent, we romanticize how these empires functioned and how complete their control was. We imagine them as these large, uniform swaths of united people, when the reality couldn't be more different. There is also a lot of middle ground between great Roman-esque empires and small barbarian villages. The diversity of polities and people groups was far larger than we might expect. One of the fun scales to look at is early democracy versus autocracy and the importance of bureaucracy. Now, let's start by talking about democracy, bureaucracy, and autocracy. We talked about how state formation requires coercion and inequality in the last part. This is due to how people in general will choose a more egalitarian life when possible, and they will actively fight against bullies and those trying to set themselves above to maintain it. This process of state development and building hierarchical societies is complicated, and there are a lot of paths that can be taken. To build more depth into our maps, we want to look at two main categories of political development that happened in early states: democracy and autocracy, and where these tended to occur. This section is generally based on The Decline and Rise of Democracy, A Global History from Antiquity to Today by David Stasevich, but let's get started by talking about early democracy first. What most of us picture when we think of democracy is quite different than what we are talking about here. Democracy has a deep history going back much further than many may realize, and modern democracy has changed significantly from its conception. In early democracy, the ruler would govern along with a council or assembly that was not subject to his command, and these councils were accountable to local assemblies. The important part is that people had power in how they were governed. There were many flavors of early democracy. This system could have hereditary or council-elected leaders, and the councils could have more widespread participation or be limited to the elites. This early democracy includes forms of oligarchy, rule of the few, and tiered councils, so local councils that representatives answered to. In antiquity, this form of early democracy was extremely common. It combined the coercion and inequality of state formation with humanity's tendency towards egalitarianism. Evidence of early democracy can be found all around the world and lasted for thousands of years. Modern democracy, largely a European invention, is much more recent. A few hallmarks of modern democracy that differ from early democracy include episodic participation and coexistence with state bureaucracy. Episodic participation is where the broader populace only participates during election time, and coexistence with state bureaucracy is where it feels like day-to-day governance is out of people's control. Regardless of the kind of rule, rulers had to have some form of consent from the people they ruled. On the autocratic end, this could merely extend to the people not revolting, where democracy saw people heavily involved in governance and required consent and cooperation from the people being ruled. I want to note 3 main factors that led to early democracy. First, small-scale settings. The people needed the ability to travel to and participate in councils or assemblies regularly to maintain democracy. Representatives could ease some of the pressure of larger settings, but this only went so far and was still very limited. Lack of production knowledge. We know how important taxation is for state formation, and if the rulers don't have a way to know what is being produced, they can't tax it correctly. A revolt could follow if you taxed too high, but you could lose potential revenue if you taxed too low. Bureaucracy could handle the measuring and assessment of production, but so could local representatives in the form of democracy. Last, who needed who more? Rulers were more likely to rule collaboratively when they needed revenue or military participation, such as in times of war, more so than the people needed the ruler's governance. The biggest factor affecting how much the people needed their rulers was exit options, aka the cost of dispersal. If it would be easy for a people to leave and still survive well enough, they will abandon any ruler that makes their life too difficult. This is seen across many species beyond humans as well. So if the cost of dispersal is low, you will tend to see less social hierarchy. So both growth in population density and sprawl would make democracy more difficult. The larger distances that had to be traveled to participate in the government, the harder democracy would be to maintain and the less satisfied the population would be. Higher population density also limited exit options, making the position of the people weaker. The higher the population density, the less likely early democracy would have been. As stated by Stasavage, once populations exceeded 25 people per square mile, no councils at all. For a comparison, an estimation of Augustan Rome has population density at 25.7 thousand people per square mile. That is 1,000 times the size. As the scale of societies grew and exit options dwindled, early democracy became less effective and declined. So what did we see in these cases instead? The alternative to early democracy was autocracy, the rule of a single person with absolute power. Ruling a growing society could not be managed by a single individual, so autocracies typically had a state bureaucracy that was controlled by the ruler and who helped manage governance, assess production, and organize taxation, etc. The larger scope of resources to manage required a more effective bureaucracy, and technologies like writing systems, math, ledgers, geometry to calculate plot yields and sizes made all that bureaucratic management easier. Of particular note, intensive agriculture, which improved yields and was important to handle growing populations, also made production more compact and systematic, which was easier to manage by bureaucracy. Another difference is that in early democracies, the people participated in the military in exchange for political power, so in autocracies, the military typically had to be paid for. All this means that the larger a polity grew, the less effective democracy was, and the more bureaucratic management was required, the more effective autocracy was. Bureaucracy was also hard to get rid of once it was established. It tended to be inherited by subsequent civilizations and survived significant dislocations. However, if it was entirely destroyed, such as with the fall of Rome, it was difficult to rebuild from scratch. Let's talk about how bureaucracy comes into this. Now, obviously, history saw some democracies outlasting population growth. They did not all turn into autocracies. I think the key here is that early democracy alone could not survive this. What was needed to scale up was bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is a system of governance where state officials, as opposed to elected representatives, made many important decisions and managed administrative and organizational tasks. Bureaucracy, by default, gives the people a weaker position, as production knowledge and other benefits could be attained through bureaucracy and not just from representatives. In most cases where bureaucracy emerged first, there was little need for democracy and autocracies were formed instead. People prefer a more egalitarian life though, so where democracy emerged first, there tended to be a combination of councils and bureaucracy as population scaled up, as opposed to autocracies. One of the big factors that would pressure a democracy to adopt bureaucracy was population pressures. More intensive high-yield agriculture would be required to field more people on the same amount of land, and this typically required a bureaucracy to manage once they outgrew democracy on its own. The roots of democracy versus autocracy, scale, exit options, and uncertainty of production, are also the roots of a weak versus strong state. This is something I see a lot of people confused about in discussions on states. Knowing how strong or weak a state is will tell you a lot about how that polity will run, what rights the people will have, and how much freedom and voice the people will have. A weak state needs its people more than the people need them, and thus has less power to coerce. A weak state will tend to be smaller and more democratic and thus less centralized as power is more dispersed. The weak position of the rulers means they need the cooperation of the people. On the other hand, a strong state has significant leverage over its people, where they need the state far more than the state needs them. These states tend strongly towards autocracy. The people of a strong state tend to have few options to leave and have a lot of oversight from a state bureaucracy. Due to this, strong states will have much more centralized power, as little power must be distributed to the people. The strong position of the rulers means they have little need for the cooperation of the people. But with that, I think we're ready to map the start of our political development now. Alright, so we can briefly map the areas in which autocracy versus early democracy will take root, and which of these areas will have bureaucracy. For the most part, you can mark entire clusters from our cultural divides map as either autocratic or democratic. But here is our map that we made of the clusters. All the gray areas are our poor traversal areas, and then within each color, you would sort of expect there to be a lot of similarities. And again, for my maps, I decided that human migration has not reached my southernmost continent, so we're not going to be worrying about that yet. It will come into play in the next part when we go through the Middle Ages maps, because the discovery shall occur. Alright, so our antiquity map is divided into states, nomadic twins, mostly settled, and mostly migratory people. We already considered a lot of the factors for democracy and autocracy when we created that map, so taxability of crops, pressure for agricultural advancement, etc., which, just a snapshot of what we looked at in the last part below with the different types of main taxable crops. So, mostly nomadic groups will have a strong tendency to be more democratic. Early states will have a strong tendency towards being autocratic and bureaucratic. Mostly settled groups will have a higher chance for being autocratic than entirely nomadic groups, but will still tend towards being democratic. I made this little kind of scale here at the bottom where you can see the different initial base types, and I color-coded it, of course, and then whether or not they would have a higher likelihood of being democratic or autocratic. The same rules apply in everything that we've done here already. None of this is hard and fast rules, right? And all the exceptions, or not even exceptions, but the least likely things can sometimes be the most interesting. Alright, so I will be adding some markings for autocratic leaning areas and line markings for democratic leaning areas. This is a little messy to look at, but I have our antiquity map on low transparency in the background. And the gray crossed areas are the poor traversal areas from our clusters map. I just kind of added a new layer with those on it. And this is mainly what I'm going to be referencing for this part, just so that you can sort of see, the divides and everything here. Alright, so here I have marked in autocratic versus democratic, mostly based on the likelihood scale at the bottom. It's a little hard to see, but it's there. And then without the poor traversal areas marked, and then with the antiquity map at full opacity, which is a bit easier to see. But this is kind of that first layer. And then here I have circled the areas where I went with the less likely scenario. These will be fun areas to develop later on. You can see I have a bunch over there in the east, and then some other ones kind of sprinkled around in each continent, just to keep it interesting. Bureaucracy, whether paired with autocracy or democracy, is incredibly important when it comes to extending control across further distances. With strong bureaucracy comes the ability to form empires. While all polities have a cycle of breaking apart and forming together, states also have a tendency to expand. The definitions for empires and imperialism go hand in hand. Empires are formed when a polity imposes control over the sovereignty of other polities, aka imperialism. But you can have imperialism without the forming of an empire, such as with more indirect forms. There is typically a core polity that governs other territory or polities on their periphery, to the disadvantage of those outside the core. The strategy of imperialism typically involves political and economic control or acquisition of territory. Empires surely would have existed in your world history already, but would have likely been much smaller than you will see going forward. Let's consider some, perhaps slightly outdated, numbers from Rein Tegepera in Size and Duration of Empires, Systematics of Size, and Walter Scheidel's chapter on the scale of empire in the Oxford World History of Empire, Volume 1, The Imperial Experience. In antiquity, many empires contained large percentages of the world population. such as the Roman Empire with perhaps 30% of the world population at the time. But world population was smaller than it is now. Most empires between 3000 and 600 BCE peaked at a total land area of around 1 million square kilometers, but were typically a fraction of that size. Between 600 BCE and 600 CE, you see empires commonly in the 3 to 5 million square kilometer range, with the largest being the Zainu Empire, a tribal confederation in the eastern Eurasian steppe, at 9 million square kilometers, which is about 6.68% of the world, in 176 BCE, and the Eastern Han Dynasty and Imperial Dynasty of China at 6.5 million square kilometers, 4.82% of the world, in 100 CE. In the Middle Ages and beyond, empires will grow to even larger scales. To share an interesting fact from Empire, the Comparative Study of Imperialism by Jenkin Merdal, if you look at shares of world population since 400 BCE, the two largest empires in the world at any time would contain around 30 to 40% of the world's population or more. The largest was usually controlling China and the other controlling northern India. It could be useful to identify a couple of your areas with early strong bureaucracy as your areas of major population density. Let's move on to nomadic and kinetic empires. Not all empires were created by the expansion of states. Many of the empires that formed in history were controlled by nomadic tribes. When you have states in an area, the pressure that is put on nomadic groups and non-state groups in general, such as encroachment and destabilization, can lead to these nomadic groups joining together to counter these neighboring forces. This can commonly result in confederations, kinetic empires, and nomadic empires. Nomadic empires typically refer to nomadic people controlling and exploiting conquered states. These successive nomadic empires of our history in particular are commonly found next to long-lasting settled empires. Nomadic empires became some of the largest in human history. As we discussed in the previous part, nomadic tribes had extreme military advantages over settled societies. Examples include the Seljuk Turks, who conquered Asia Minor and later formed the Ottoman Empire, the Huns, who controlled much of southeastern Europe, and the Vandals, who controlled part of northern Africa and the Mediterranean. Perhaps the greatest example is the Mongol Empire in the 13th and 14th centuries, which became the largest contiguous empire in history. It controlled over 100 million people. Starting with the unification of several tribal confederations, the Mongols invaded in all directions. Cities that refused to submit to their rule were exterminated as the Mongols conquered vast territories. After claiming territories, they consolidated their rule by supporting scientific advancements, incorporating the most loyal, organizing, expanding, and controlling trade routes, building infrastructure, and collecting taxes and tribute. Any cities or conquered regions that disobeyed their rule were destroyed. Through the over 150 years of the Mongol Empire, some estimates claim they killed as many as 50 to 80 million people. Kinetic empires are based on mobility and the control of key resources, usually conquering or ruling over other non-state groups, but not exclusively. Some of the best examples would be the 18th to 19th century Comanche Empire and the Lakota Empire, both in the North American plains. The Comanche were never formally unified under a single ruler, but they were still extremely powerful and controlled vast territories, raided and established trade networks, and were culturally and economically impactful. The Lakota Empire controlled buffalo hunting grounds and demanded tribute from other tribes. On to types of imperialism. There are many types of imperialism and ways an empire can be formed, but we are going to discuss a few main types based on how direct the control is: conquest, colonies, settler colonies, protectorates, and spheres of influence. It is important to note that imperial power was not usually about asserting direct control, but about imposing sovereignty. The degree to which different parts of an empire are controlled by it differ greatly and tend to be much more loose than we would expect. Historically, empires tend to be more nodal and irregular than forces of complete uniform control. Territory acquisition and conquest is about imposing direct sovereignty over the area. This is where the conquered land and/or people are absorbed into the core. Conquest differs from colonialism because instead of exerting control over a territory or people, they essentially expand into that territory or people or absorb them. Note that military or other forms of conquest can be a component of other types of imperialism as well. There can be degrees to the amount that the original identity of the land and people is wiped away. For example, the Persian or Archimedes Empire is known to have allowed conquered regions to keep their religions, cultures, traditions, etc., and were fairly tolerant. Some empires even went so far as to absorb traditions and cultural practices into their own cultures, also known as cultural blending. Some empires, on the other hand, may ban the religions of conquered regions and require religious conversion, make cultural attire or other cultural practices illegal, etc. Territory acquisition can also involve mass murder and genocide to wipe the indigenous people out instead of maintaining control over them. Migration is where a polity takes control of a new area while abandoning the one they left behind. It is not necessarily imperialistic, such as if they are moving into uninhabited areas, or make agreements with the locals to use certain bits of land. It can, however, involve conquest, where they forcibly take the land they are migrating to, and may either absorb or enslave the native population, or displace them, triggering their own migration. Migrations can be motivated by a number of factors, such as climate change or another group forcing them to leave. Medieval Europe saw many migrations of people mainly coming from the east, such as the Germans, Slavs, Huns, Turks, Mongols, etc. Colonialism and settler colonialism are both forms of more direct imperialism and strategies for empire building, where one polity is exerting sovereignty, dominion, or influence over another polity. They both involve unequal relationships between the colonizer and the ones being colonized. Colonialism is an act of imperialist rule, typically across geographic barriers such as oceans or mountains, where the colonizer asserts control over the foreign colony but does not make an attempt to resettle there. While the colonized polity is typically made inferior to the colonizer, legally, culturally, administratively, etc., they retain their land and their sovereignty. An example of this form of colonialism is the British Raj. The labor force and production of the colony is typically important. Settler colonialism, on the other hand, is where land is seized from the locals either through expulsion, assimilation, extermination, and/or subjugation for the purpose of forming their own permanent settlements. They replace indigenous populations in the long term. The new settler colonies may remain as part of their original polity, typically an empire, or they may be independent. We'll get to city-state models in a bit. Settler colonization was typically motivated by a combination of desires of the settlers and of the home polity. Some examples include to acquire resources to meet demands of the home polity, i.e. for iron, for settlers to move beyond the reach of armies and tax collectors, aka for more freedom and autonomy, economic opportunity for the home polity, land hunger and overpopulation in the home polity. For independent settler colonies, settlers want to form their own polities, to have a separate place to relocate undesirables, such as with convict colonialism, like British colonialism in Australia. Some strategies that have been used throughout history include settlement and resettlement. Conquered people were resettled elsewhere and their land settled by newcomers. Elite replacement. Highest level of elites in social hierarchy replaced with those from the colonizer. Deportation and reportation. Conquered people would be taken from their land and settled elsewhere, or switched with other conquered people, such as what happened to over 4.5 million people in the expansion of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Land distribution. Conquered lands were distributed among elites of the empire's core, but the conquered people remained as a workforce. Genocide. Violence to destroy a group of people or nation. The city-state model is where settlers form new colonies that are not part of a larger entity, but independent and autonomous. The Greek settler colonies were perhaps the first of this type of colonization, forming over 700 new city-states in a roughly 200-year period starting in the 8th century BCE. The settlers formed new polities called city-states or citizen-states that were independent from the Greek mainland. This benefited the mainland through the expansion of trade, by relieving population pressures at home, and by providing settlers with new land and the ability to form their own polities. Protectorates are when the controlled polity is allowed to govern itself, but is controlled by the controlling polity or empire. The autonomy of the controlled group can vary, but is usually limited to self-rule within the constraints of the empire, with little control over foreign relations. there is typically less presence of the controlling polity within the protectorate. This less direct control typically requires the threat of invasion, punishment to maintain the protectorate. Spheres of influence is a very indirect form of control, where the controlling party has certain rights and privileges over the polity, commonly due to a treaty. This could involve the rights to gather certain resources, use sea or land-based routes, station troops, require tribute, etc. Now that we've covered all of that, let's start expanding our antiquity map. Alright, so this graphic here shows the maximum linear extent of large empires and countries. But as we discussed before, around the time of our antiquity maps, we might expect our largest empires to be most commonly in the 3 to 5 million square kilometer range, perhaps peaking as high as 6.5. And for reference, the modern day land area of India is just under 3 million square kilometers, as you can see here. And I'm hoping this is giving you a good size reference to be able to map things out on your world. And for Australia, it is 7.7 million square kilometers, so sort of in that range would be your largest. And then there will also likely be a larger number of smaller empires, likely in clusters in the peripheries of these larger ones. These will likely range in the 100 to 300,000 square kilometer range, and Italy here for reference is 300,000 square kilometers. So, as technological advances, bureaucracy, and political structures tend to spread within areas with more interaction, so aka within our cultural clusters. You will tend to find empires clustered in a few areas of your map, and I'm going to keep this a bit more simple for this example map that I'm creating in this guide, just because it makes it a little bit easier, but feel free to go a little bit crazy here. So, your nomadic state twins are more likely to develop nomadic and kinetic empires over their adjacent states than other nomadic groups. Due to the simplicity we are aiming for with our antiquity map, we aren't going to get much into the different types of forming state empires, so colonialism versus conquest, etc. This will be a major focus in our Middle Ages eras maps, though. So, as we work through each step, I'm going to circle the relevant areas for, each step that I'm going to be marking, and then we'll look at that as a whole. But we're going to start with looking at the areas on your antiquity map that are marked as state. So these are those blue areas that you can see here. So first we are going to place a few long-lived empires in a few clustered locations out of your autocratic states. And for these we're going to place individual ones, right? So you can see with the little gray circles where I have those marked. So I have some over here, one here, and a couple over there. And then next we are going to mark our remaining autocratic states. So in this case it is the blue areas with the pink hashes over them as autocratic states. So I have those circled here. And then we'll mark any of the remaining ones. These are going to be your democratic states as democratic and bureaucratic states. You're probably not going to see many states develop without some level of bureaucracy. All right, so then here are the state global polity types. So I circled the long-lived empires to represent individual empires. It's a little hard to see on this map, but they are individually circled. And I was pretty simplistic with this since it's just an example. And you can see the rest of my key here over on the left. There's going to be 3 subtypes for each major type that we've kind of already mapped. But so then we are going to go on to the settled areas of our map. So look at your antiquity map that are marked primarily settled non-state groups. First, mark your autocratic settled areas as autocratic settled groups. This is pretty easy. Settled is our orange color, and we're looking for the pink hashes over the orange areas. So next we're going to mark some of your democratic settled areas, mainly closer to the states, as democratic and bureaucratic settled groups. So you can see most of these, with a few exceptions, are really close next to major states. And then 3, mark some of the democratic settled areas mainly further from states, these should be your remaining ones, as democratic settled groups. And that looks like this. These are our settled global polity types. So now we're going to look at the areas on our antiquity map that are marked as state twins. So mark some of these areas, primarily those around long-lived empires, as nomadic empires, especially those connected to multiple state areas and those that are more autocratic. So you can see I have a couple of these circled here. And then next mark some of the remaining ones as kinetic empires, especially those connected to multiple state areas and those that are more autocratic. And I want you to look at any remaining state twins. These should be just general migratory groups. And then also look at the areas on your antiquity maps that are marked as primarily migratory and mark them as migratory groups. So these are going to be any of the remaining purple areas, and all of your green areas will be just migratory groups. So you can see them circled here. It's a good portion of the map. And then here it all is filled in as the twins and migratory areas are all of these different green colors. And I'm pretty happy with this map. It's a little bit more detailed. It's not crazy more detailed. We're not getting into super intense granularity, and other than our long-lived empires, which there would be plenty of short-lived empires in here, right? Like we've talked about how empires tended to form and deform, break into, more centralized groups and then decentralize, and like this whole cycle, right? As a lot of different factors are changing and ebbing and flowing. This is just like a little snapshot of our world. And the same applies to like nomadic empires and stuff. Like they're going to be ebbing and flowing. They won't always be empires. Like sometimes groups will form if there's a particular reason, and then they'll break back apart when there's not a reason. There's all that layers of complication, and we'll get into this more with our later maps. But in general, I think this is fun, and it sets us up to having a bit more information about what the goals and what the political strategies of these different groups will be for moving forward into the next layers of the maps. Now that we have a good grasp on empires, imperialism, democracy, autocracy, and bureaucracy, we can move on to making our Middle Ages maps in the next part. All of my references and resources are listed at the bottom of the blog post for this part, linked in the description below. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to support my channel, you can subscribe, like, share this video, and my Ko-fi account is linked in the description. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.